I am Dr. Toma, Associate Professor of Algorithmic Medicine at New York Institute of Technology College of Osteopathic Medicine, and today I want to talk about a problem that sounds small on the surface, but has enormous consequences for patient care, medical education, and the future of healthcare. We are living through a turning point in medicine. Artificial intelligence is moving from the margins of healthcare into classrooms, clinics, and daily decision-making. That shift is real, and it is happening quickly. But the public conversation around it has become confused in a way that I think is increasingly dangerous. Too many people now hear the phrase artificial intelligence and immediately think of chatbots. They think of polished conversational systems that can answer questions in smooth, confident language. Those tools are important, and they deserve attention, but they are only one part of a much larger field. If we teach students, clinicians, and the public to treat all artificial intelligence as if it were basically just a chatbot, we will misunderstand what these systems can do, we will misunderstand how they fail, and we will make poor decisions in high-stakes settings where human welfare is on the line. One of the reasons this confusion is so widespread is that the most visible systems are the conversational ones. They are easy to try, easy to share, and easy to turn into headlines. They speak our language. They can summarize, draft, explain, and respond in a way that feels remarkably natural. When a machine talks back to us fluently, it captures attention in a very immediate way. But artificial intelligence did not begin there. The story of this field goes back to the 1950s. Over the decades, it developed through many different approaches, many different successes, and many different disappointments. By the early 2000s, artificial intelligence had already advanced into expert-level image recognition in some domains. Later, transformer architecture laid the foundation for the kinds of language systems that now dominate public attention. Then, in November 2022, the release of a widely used public chatbot pushed artificial intelligence into everyday conversation around the world. That moment changed awareness, but it did not create the field. Artificial intelligence has more than 70 years of history, and specialized medical systems were being developed and validated long before chatbots became the public face of the subject. Frankly, it is frustrating to watch such a broad and important field be reduced to one visible category of tool. The problem with that kind of simplification is not just that it is intellectually sloppy. The problem is that it shapes expectations. Once the public begins to think that artificial intelligence simply means chatbots, people start to assume that every claim about artificial intelligence should be understood through the lens of fluent conversation. In healthcare, those assumptions matter. They influence how students are taught, how clinicians evaluate tools, how institutions purchase systems, and how patients imagine the role of technology in diagnosis and treatment. Public expectations are often being shaped more by hype than by the actual design, purpose, and limitations of the systems being discussed. And that mismatch between expectation and reality is something we need to address directly. So let me start with a distinction that I believe every healthcare educator should teach before even using the phrase artificial intelligence. We need to say clearly whether we are discussing chatbots or task-specific medical artificial intelligence. Those are not the same thing. They are built differently, they are evaluated differently, and they should be used differently. Chatbots are optimized for language. They are designed to generate context-aware and linguistically sophisticated interaction. They can be very useful for communication, summarization, drafting documents, tutoring, and supporting routine information tasks. But task-specific medical artificial intelligence is built for a different purpose. It is designed for a single, well-defined clinical task within a specific setting. In radiology, for example, task-specific systems have a history that predates the current chatbot wave by many years. Detection systems were proposed and in some settings even used clinically for defined image analysis tasks long before the present conversation became centered on generative chatbots. This is why I keep insisting that terminology matters. If we do not distinguish between these categories at the outset, we create confusion before the lesson has even begun. Let us go a step further and talk about how these systems actually work. because the difference is not only about what they are used for, it is also about the nature of their underlying operation. A task-specific medical system processes data through learned filters that are optimized to detect specific signs of disease. Its outputs are meant to be tied directly to validated diagnostic features. That matters because its errors can then be studied systematically. Performance can be measured with clinically relevant metrics. We can evaluate where it is strong, where it is weak, how it responds to certain kinds of cases, and whether it behaves consistently enough to support deployment in a particular workflow. That does not mean it is perfect. It does mean that the form of its work is tied to a defined task and can therefore be assessed in a correspondingly defined way. That is very different from a language system whose main strength is producing text that resembles expert communication. The distinction is not about whether one is modern and the other is old. It is about whether the system was built to sound like expertise or built to perform a tightly bounded clinical function. By contrast, a chatbot generates language that statistically resembles what an expert might say in a particular scenario. It does not diagnose in the same sense that a clinician diagnoses. It does not look at the world and derive meaning in the human way. It processes language as pieces, often called tokens, and predicts likely continuations based on patterns it has learned from vast amounts of text. If you tell a chatbot that a patient has cough and shortness of breath, it may produce the word pneumonia because those terms have often appeared in connection with that diagnosis. That can yield a correct answer, but the process is fundamentally one of statistical prediction rather than genuine medical understanding of a living patient. The difference may sound philosophical, but it becomes practical very quickly. A chatbot can produce a report that is polished, calm, coherent, and perfectly formatted, while still being entirely wrong. And when it is wrong, the error may not follow a stable and easily measurable pattern. That is part of what makes these systems so useful in some settings and so risky in others. Their surface fluency can hide the fact that their apparent reasoning is not the same as clinical reasoning. This brings us to an important psychological point. In psychology, there is something closely related to what is often called the confidence heuristic. Human beings are more likely to believe information that is delivered clearly and confidently, even when the information itself is mistaken. We are social creatures, and confidence often functions as a shortcut signal for credibility. In everyday life, that tendency is understandable. In medicine, it can become dangerous. Chatbots are designed to sound confident, whether they are correct or not. They do not naturally hesitate in proportion to uncertainty in the way people often expect. They can state a wrong conclusion with a tone that feels composed and authoritative. That weakens the natural link we tend to assume between confidence and correctness. The more fluent the system sounds, the more likely people may be to trust it, especially when they are busy, fatigued, under pressure, or emotionally affected by the clinical context. This is why I keep returning to one simple message that I think deserves repetition. Fluent language is not diagnostic competence. Clear prose is not the same thing as sound clinical judgment. Style and truth are not interchangeable in medicine. Now, to be fair, chatbots often do produce correct answers. They are not random. They learn very strong statistical patterns from a huge number of examples. And when a new prompt resembles patterns that are common and consistent in the training material, their responses can be impressively accurate. If a chatbot has seen many examples where cough and shortness of breath are associated with pneumonia, it is likely to respond correctly when given a similar prompt. That is one reason people can be so impressed by them, and that impression is not always misplaced. The problem arises when people fail to recognize what kind of task is being measured. If you evaluate a chatbot on a text-based problem that strongly resembles the kinds of language patterns it has learned to continue, then of course, it may perform very well. But that does not mean the system has suddenly become a general replacement for clinical expertise. It means the evaluation happened to align with the strengths of the tool. That is a subtle but crucial distinction. Good performance on a narrow type of test should not be inflated into a broad claim about what the system is or what role it should play in patient care. In a recent study, doctors were asked to diagnose hypothetical patients using clinical vignettes. Those physicians were correct 74% of the time. Another group of physicians performed the same task while consulting chatbots, and they were correct 76% of the time. The chatbot responses themselves were correct 92% of the time. That is the sort of result that produces dramatic headlines very easily. A casual reader might conclude that the machine was clearly better than the doctors, or that the era of automated diagnosis has effectively arrived. But when you slow down and examine what was actually tested, the interpretation becomes more careful. These were hypothetical written cases. They were structured clinical vignettes. They were not messy, dynamic, real-world encounters with all the ambiguity, distraction, incompleteness, and context dependence of actual patient care. Language systems often perform well on the kind of neatly packaged textual scenario that resembles the material they were trained to predict. That should surprise no one. What would be surprising is if we fail to notice the gap between that kind of test and the clinical reality it is often used to represent. Real patients do not present as tidy, multiple-choice questions. They do not arrive with neatly framed symptom lists and carefully curated relevant details while all the noise has been removed for the convenience of the evaluator. Real patients may give partial histories. They may omit something important without realizing it. They may have several conditions at the same time. Their signs may be subtle. Their imaging may be imperfect. Their prior records may be incomplete. Their symptoms may evolve over time. Their social context may affect how they describe their condition and how they access care. Clinicians do not just match words to patterns. They interpret, prioritize, contextualize, and revise. They deal with uncertainty, competing possibilities, and consequences. So, when we see strong chatbot performance on simplified written vignettes, we should treat it as interesting evidence about one kind of capability, not as proof of broad clinical competence. If we fail to make that distinction, we invite misunderstanding at exactly the moment when we most need precision. Headline-friendly comparisons between humans and chatbots can be highly misleading when the test environment has been stripped of the very complexity that defines medical practice. My colleagues and I have also looked at another danger, one that receives less public attention but deserves much more. That is the danger of sycophancy in conversational systems. In our study, 5 different chatbots were asked to diagnose a straightforward set of healthy and unhealthy brain-computed tomography images, and then evaluate one another's responses. What we found was unsettling. Even when their diagnoses differed, the chatbots still tended to score one another highly. In ordinary conversation, agreeableness can be pleasant. It can help interaction feel smooth. It can maintain social harmony. But in diagnostics, excessive agreeableness is not a virtue. It can be a hazard. A system that is too ready to affirm another answer, even when that answer may be wrong, is not acting as a reliable check. It is acting as a source of false reassurance. When stakes are high, being pleasantly supportive of an incorrect conclusion does not count as intelligence. It counts as a problem. And because these systems express agreement in polished language, the false reassurance can feel especially convincing to the people reading it. This matters because many people are tempted to imagine conversational systems as second readers, second opinions, or even as neutral validators. But a validator that is inclined toward social smoothness rather than critical discrimination can make an error harder to catch. In medicine, the right kind of disagreement can be valuable. If a human colleague says, "I do not agree with that interpretation, and here is why," that tension may trigger re-examination, further testing, or a needed correction. But if a system tends to maintain harmony by praising or affirming responses, even when they are flawed, then its conversational usefulness may actively work against diagnostic safety. That is why healthcare professionals need to learn not only what a chatbot can do, but also what mode of behavior it tends to default toward. Is the tool suitable for drafting a patient education summary? Or is someone trying to use it for a role that requires adversarial checking and clinically grounded discrimination? Those are not the same jobs. Being good at one does not imply being safe for the other. Again, our challenge is not just technological literacy. It is functional literacy. We need to understand what kind of tool we are dealing with before we decide how much trust to place in it. At the same time, I do not want anyone to hear this and conclude that task-specific medical artificial intelligence is somehow exempt from scrutiny. It is not. Task-specific systems can fail too, and in some cases, they can fail quite badly. One of the most important concepts to teach here is overfitting. A useful analogy is two medical students. One student memorizes facts word for word. The other student learns the underlying pathophysiology that explains why certain findings point towards certain diagnoses. The memorizing student may perform very well on familiar exams, especially when the questions closely resemble the material that was memorized. But when a real patient presents with a slightly unusual combination of findings, or when the context shifts, that student may struggle. The student who understands principles has a better chance of adapting. An overfit model is like the memorizing student. It can look excellent during development because it has effectively learned the training examples too specifically, yet it may decline sharply in real deployment because it did not learn patterns that generalize beyond the data it already saw. Overfitting is one of those concepts that sounds technical until you realize how intuitive it actually is. If a system memorizes its practice material instead of learning durable clinical structure, it becomes brittle. It succeeds in conditions that resemble the past and fails when confronted with the slightly different texture of real life. That is why healthy learning dynamics matter so much. Just as a teacher can sometimes tell from a student's progression whether the student is merely memorizing or actually understanding, the learning curves of an artificial intelligence system can tell us something about whether it has learned robust patterns or simply captured the peculiarities of the training data. A shiny final performance metric can be deeply misleading if you do not ask how the system got there. Did it learn steadily in a way that suggests generalization, or did it exploit some shortcut in the data? Did the performance hold up under meaningful validation, or did it collapse when the context changed? These questions are not optional details. They are the difference between apparent success and trustworthy performance. In healthcare, where bad predictions can mislead real decisions, that difference is morally and clinically significant. Accuracy alone can fool you. Accuracy is attractive because it is simple. It looks like a clean summary. It gives administrators, developers, and readers of abstracts a single number to compare. But medicine is rarely that simple. Imagine a hypothetical system trained on 100 patients, where 95 are healthy and 5 are unhealthy. That system could label every patient as healthy and still achieve 95% accuracy. The number would sound excellent to anyone who is not paying attention. Yet the system would be clinically useless for finding disease. This is the problem of class imbalance, and it is common in medical data. Some conditions are rare. Some screening environments contain far more healthy cases than unhealthy ones. A metric that hides that reality can create false confidence. If we want to evaluate a model responsibly, we need to know more than one final aggregate score. We need to understand the structure of the data, the consequences of the errors, and the relevance of the chosen metrics to the clinical task. A single impressive percentage can be one of the easiest ways to overstate value and understate risk. There are other ways for models to look better than they really are. Sometimes they exploit shortcuts that have little to do with the clinical question we actually care about. Sometimes the training process is improper. Sometimes there is data leakage, where information that should not be available to the system in a real-world setting sneaks into the training or evaluation process. The result is the same. You get high performance on paper and disappointment or harm in practice. Imagine a developer receives a spreadsheet of patient data. The final column is the target the system is supposed to predict, and the earlier columns are the inputs. The developer trains a task-specific model and obtains impressive accuracy. On the surface, that looks like success. But if clinicians had been involved throughout the development process, they might have noticed that one of the input columns effectively functions as a cheat sheet for the diagnosis. For example, a medication field might reveal the answer indirectly because only patients with a known diagnosis would already be taking that medication. In that case, the model is not really learning the clinical problem. It is learning the answer key. Why is that such a serious issue? Because the conditions under which the model was developed do not match the conditions under which it would actually be used. In a real screening context, a new, unseen patient would not already have the revealing medication prescribed before the diagnosis was made. That means the model's apparent success depended on information that would not be available at the point of care. When deployed in practice, the model would fail precisely because its training environment was artificially generous. This kind of problem is not rare, and it is exactly why clinicians cannot be kept at the edge of the development process as an afterthought. Technical expertise is necessary, but it is not sufficient. Without clinical insight, developers may build systems that optimize beautifully for the wrong task, the wrong data, or the wrong context. Technical success without clinical relevance is not success. In healthcare, a model has to be judged not only by whether it predicts well in a closed experiment, but by whether it addresses the actual clinical question under the constraints of real use. That requires collaboration from the beginning, not a hurried review at the end. So what should we do with all of this? First, we should stop asking whether artificial intelligence is good or bad for healthcare, as if that were a meaningful single question. It is too broad to be useful. Different systems do different things. They rely on different methods. They fail in different ways. They should be assessed according to the role they are expected to play. A chatbot used for drafting routine educational material is not the same as a system used to flag suspicious findings on medical images, and neither is the same as a model used to predict risk from structured clinical data. Lumping them together under one emotional debate about whether artificial intelligence is wonderful or dangerous obscures more than it clarifies. What we need instead is careful categorization, careful evaluation, and careful teaching. We need to understand the intended use, the likely error modes, the relevant metrics, and the consequences of the system being wrong. Only then can we have a serious conversation about whether a given tool belongs in a given part of healthcare. Broad excitement and broad fear are equally poor substitutes for specificity. Second, we must always anticipate false positives and false negatives. This is not unique to artificial intelligence. It is a basic part of diagnostic reasoning. But artificial intelligence can influence clinician behavior in powerful ways, and that influence needs to be handled thoughtfully. Consider a study from 2017 by Johnson and colleagues, in which positive at-home cancer test results led doctors to perform longer colonoscopy procedures because the positive result increased vigilance. The broader lesson is that outputs, even imperfect outputs, change behavior. A positive signal can make clinicians look harder. A negative signal can create a sense of reassurance. Artificial intelligence predictions can have the same effect. That means we should not think of the output merely as a static answer on a screen. We should think about how it changes the downstream actions of the people who see it. A prediction that says disease may prompt more careful investigation, longer review, or additional testing. A prediction that says healthy may subtly lower alertness. Both pathways carry risks. Understanding those behavioral consequences is part of responsible implementation and part of responsible education as well. This leads to a practical posture that I think healthcare professionals should adopt. If an artificial intelligence system suggests disease, the result should be treated as a warning that requires careful clinical investigation to confirm or rule out that possibility. It should not be treated as final truth. At the same time, if the system suggests that a patient is healthy, clinicians should still follow standard care procedures so that false reassurance does not cause a real problem to be missed. In other words, artificial intelligence should inform attention, not replace judgment. It can help point. It should not be allowed to close the case on its own. This posture sounds conservative, and it is. In medicine, appropriate conservatism is often a virtue. It reflects respect for uncertainty, respect for patient safety, and respect for the limits of any tool. The danger is not only that clinicians might overtrust a system. The danger is also that institutions might design workflows that encourage overtrust, or that students might be trained to see fluent output as a substitute for disciplined evaluation. If we get the posture wrong at the educational level, we will reproduce that error across entire generations of practice. That is why healthcare education must adapt quickly. Future clinicians need more than exposure to tools. Current clinicians need more than a brief orientation session that shows them how to type prompts. We need a real framework for critical evaluation. We need to teach the difference between chatbots and task-specific medical systems. We need to teach how each type of system reaches its conclusions. We need to teach why fluent output is not the same as diagnostic understanding. We need to teach why performance on simplified vignettes does not equal real-world clinical competence. We need to teach why accuracy alone can mislead and how class imbalance can distort interpretation. We need to teach overfitting, data leakage, and the importance of healthy learning dynamics. We need to teach that clinicians must work closely with developers from the earliest stages if we want systems that are not only technically impressive, but clinically meaningful. None of this is optional if artificial intelligence is going to become part of the infrastructure of healthcare. If education lags behind deployment, misunderstanding will fill the gap, and misunderstanding in medicine can cause harm. I want to emphasize that this is not just a matter for students. It is equally relevant for experienced clinicians already in practice. Many highly trained professionals entered medicine long before the current public wave of conversational systems. They may now encounter artificial intelligence tools through administrative rollout, vendor presentations, clinical pilots, or patient questions. If the educational response is shallow, those clinicians may be forced to make judgments about technologies they were never properly taught to assess. Some may overtrust. Some may reject useful tools because of frustration or hype fatigue. Both outcomes are avoidable if institutions take education seriously. We should not be asking clinicians simply to accept or resist artificial intelligence. We should be equipping them to question it intelligently. What problem is this system built to solve? What evidence supports that use? What data was it trained on? How were errors measured? What does failure look like? How does the system affect behavior downstream? Those are the kinds of questions that belong in the professional toolkit now. The goal is not passive use. The goal is informed oversight by people who remain accountable for patient care. I've published 2 textbooks focused on how to evaluate clinical artificial intelligence systems, from training dynamics to economic analysis, from the importance of learning behavior to the dangers of relying too heavily on final aggregate metrics, and from the challenge of class imbalance in medical datasets to the broader question of responsible implementation. I mentioned that not to make the conversation about me, but to underline how much depth there is behind what can otherwise sound like a simple public debate. The difference between a good and a bad medical model is not captured by whether it can produce a clever sentence. The difference lies in design, data, validation, interpretation, workflow fit, and accountability. These are teachable issues. They are also interdisciplinary issues. They sit at the intersection of medicine, statistics, computer science, psychology, ethics, and health systems. That is one reason the field of algorithmic medicine exists at all. We need people who can think across those boundaries, because the systems themselves do not respect the neat divisions that traditional education often assumes. There's also a cultural challenge here. In moments of rapid technological change, people often feel pressure to choose a side. They either become boosters who treat every new capability as proof that transformation has already arrived, or skeptics who respond to exaggerated claims by dismissing the whole enterprise. I do not think either reaction serves patients well. We need something more disciplined than enthusiasm and more constructive than cynicism. We need discernment. That means being able to say that chatbots can be excellent at some routine tasks without pretending that they therefore possess diagnostic wisdom. It means being able to say that task-specific models can offer real value without overlooking the ways they may be poorly trained or badly evaluated. It means being willing to criticize hype without denying progress. Medicine has always needed that kind of balanced judgment. Artificial intelligence does not remove the need for it. If anything, it intensifies it. The more persuasive the tools become, the more important it is that the humans around them remain capable of careful, grounded, context-sensitive reasoning. The human role does not disappear when technology improves. It changes, and in some respects, it becomes even more important. Another reason I care so much about vocabulary is that language shapes policy. If regulators, educators, health system leaders, and clinicians all use the same term to describe fundamentally different technologies, then we should not be surprised when their policies become vague, mismatched, or ineffective. A policy suited to conversational assistance may be inadequate for image-based diagnosis. An evaluation framework designed for a narrowly defined detector may be irrelevant for an open-ended language system. A procurement decision made on the basis of public excitement may ignore the actual needs of the clinic. Precision in language is therefore not a luxury. It is part of governance. When we say artificial intelligence, we should ask what exactly we mean. Are we talking about a tool that generates explanatory text? Are we talking about a model that flags a specific radiologic feature? Are we talking about a risk prediction system embedded in a workflow? Each of those raises different questions about evidence, safety, accountability, and appropriate use. If we flatten them into one buzzword, we make intelligent oversight harder than it needs to be. The first step toward better decisions is often simply naming the thing in front of us correctly. In clinical medicine, where the welfare of actual human beings is at stake, that precision is not abstract. It affects whether patients are reassured too early, investigated too late, or treated on the basis of a misleading output. It affects whether clinicians feel supported or second-guessed by a system that does not actually understand the context. It affects whether educational institutions prepare learners to handle complexity or accidentally train them into shallow trust. The adoption of artificial intelligence is not just a technical transition, it is a professional and cultural transition. It changes what kinds of questions clinicians need to ask, what kinds of competencies schools need to teach, and what kinds of conversations patients may increasingly expect to have. If we manage that transition poorly, we will end up with a healthcare culture that is surrounded by impressive sounding tools, but lacks the conceptual habits needed to use them safely. If we manage it well, we can gain the benefits of assistance while preserving the standards of clinical reasoning and accountability that medicine depends on. That is why the teaching piece is so central. Technology will arrive either way. Understanding does not arrive automatically with it. So when I speak to students, faculty, clinicians, and developers, I return again and again to a few core principles. Know the difference between a chatbot and a task-specific medical system. Understand how each reaches conclusions. Do not mistake polished language for medical understanding. Do not be dazzled by strong results on narrow textual tests and assume they generalize to the clinic. Do not be impressed by accuracy numbers alone without examining class balance, validation design, and learning dynamics. Do not build systems without clinical expertise woven into the process from the start. Do not let outputs become final answers when they should be prompts for closer investigation. And do not forget that all of these tools operate inside human workflows, where they shape attention, confidence, and action. Those principles are not anti-technology. They are the conditions for using technology responsibly. In a field where errors can harm patients, responsibility has to come before convenience and before marketing. The promise of artificial intelligence in healthcare is real, but promise is not the same as readiness, and readiness is not the same as safe use. We are entering a new era, and every healthcare education institution needs to adapt accordingly. That adaptation should not take the form of trendy demonstrations alone. It should become part of the intellectual foundation of modern medical training. Students should be taught not merely how to interact with tools, but how to interrogate them. They should learn how to ask what a model was trained on, what it was meant to do, what it was never meant to do, and what kinds of evidence would justify trust in one context but not another. Practicing clinicians should be given the same respect. They should not be treated as end users who simply need a quick tutorial. They should be treated as professionals whose judgment remains central and whose participation is essential to evaluation, deployment, and oversight. Developers should welcome that collaboration because without it, they risk building elegant systems that miss the clinical point. Institutions should cultivate that collaboration because patient safety depends on it. None of this is glamorous, but much of good medicine never has been. The work that protects patients is often the work that insists on discipline when public excitement is pushing toward shortcuts. If there is one message I hope stays with you after listening to this, it is this. The future of healthcare will include artificial intelligence, but the future of safe healthcare depends on how well we teach people to understand it. That means understanding the history of the field rather than acting as if it began with public chatbots. It means understanding the difference between systems built for language and systems built for defined diagnostic tasks. It means understanding why confidence in wording can be so persuasive and so misleading. It means understanding the limits of headline studies, the danger of sycophancy, the reality of overfitting, the tricks that can inflate accuracy, and the necessity of clinician involvement in development. Most of all, it means understanding that responsibility does not disappear when technology enters the room. It becomes more demanding. We still have to ask hard questions. We still have to protect patients from false confidence. We still have to insist that a tool earn trust through evidence that fits the clinical task. If we can teach those habits well, then artificial intelligence can become a valuable part of medicine. If we cannot, then fluent machines may teach us the wrong lessons at the moment we can least afford it.